Good morning. My name is Jennifer Wistran, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute. Thank you for joining us for a discussion of Russian disinformation in the 21st century. Before I introduce our guests, I'd like to remind you that you can stay up to date on the Kennan Institute's activities by visiting the Kennan Institute's website and subscribing to our blogs and podcasts. Additionally, since this is our 50th anniversary year, I'd like to encourage you to view the Kennan Institute's 50th anniversary timeline, which is also on our website. So today's guests are Sir John Scarlett, Peter Pomerantsev, Dr. Sarah Oates, and Jill Dougherty. So as you can see, we've gotten a phenomenal lineup for you guys this morning. Just brief introductions. I can't go extensively into each of our phenomenal guests, but Sir John Scarlett is the co-chair of the Wilson Center Global Advisory Council, the chairman of SC Strategy, and the former chief of the British Intelligence Service, MI6. Peter Pomerantsev is a journalist and a senior fellow at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. He is also the author of several acclaimed books on Russia and disinformation, including Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, This is Not Propaganda, and How to Win an Information War. Dr. Sarah Oates is a former Kennan Institute Fellow and a professor and Associate Dean for Research at the Philip Merrill College of Journalism at the University of Maryland. She's also the author of many books, including Seeing Red, Russian Propaganda and American News, which was co-authored with Gordon Neal Ramsey and published earlier this year. Finally, Jill Dougherty is a Kennan Institute Global Fellow, an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, and a regular on-air contributor about Russia for CNN. Jill also has a book coming out next year about her many decades covering Russia, from Russia, for CNN, among others. So after our guests speak, which will take about the first 30 minutes, we'll limit the conversation amongst the four of them to about 30 minutes, there's going to be a question and answer period. So we have both an online audience today and an in-person audience. For our online audience members, you can submit your questions in one of three ways: by email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, by X to @KennanInstitute, or by Facebook as a message on our page. And for our in-person audience, once we get to the question and answer period, please just raise your hand and one of our team members will come with a microphone. And just for online and in-person audience, please do introduce yourself and give your affiliation. Finally, today's discussion is being recorded. And so with that, I would like to turn to Sir John, who's going to moderate our discussion amongst our three guests.
Right, Jennifer, thank you very much indeed. Can I confirm that you can all hear me all right?
Yes, it's perfect.
You can. And you understand my accent?
That's perfect as well.
What accent?
Right. Okay. Now, I say straight away that the biggest challenge of this discussion is that we have so much to talk about. There is so much expertise here. We have a list of questions and only 30 minutes. So inevitably, we're not going to cover everything. And I must ask all my colleagues here on the panel to, make their key points, but make them as quickly as possible, and accept that we can't immediately have a long, extended discussion, however tempting that might be. But I would say that it's a pleasure and a privilege to be with you in this company. Thank you very much indeed. Such an important subject. Now we have, you have seen a list of questions, which I'd like us to cover now. And I'm going to start straight away, having made that introduction, to the first one, which is the history of Russian disinformation. Some of us have been around a certain time and have dealt with disinformation in the past. In fact, I've referred back to the 1980s and the 1990s, before, of course, media transformation in a way, and the Russian activity there, and the kind of tradition and example and baseline that actually set. So I'm interested, maybe, Jill, if I could turn to you to start with, to make whatever comments you would like to make about the history and the influence of what all our present activity flows from.
Thank you very much, Sir John. I can understand, looking at my gray hair, why you would decide that I know about that period.
But no, come on, I'm taking your statement.
Well, I lived in it. I lived through it. And actually, I would go back to, I hate to say, 1950s and 1960s up to today, because I think there are some similarities. And I was thinking about this, big picture, I would say there's no question, we all know that in the Soviet Union, they used propaganda for a variety of reasons, domestic and international. And today, Putin's Russia uses propaganda, disinformation, misinformation for many of the same reasons, for domestic and international purposes. But I would say that there is somewhat of a difference. And I worked at the Voice of America, by the way. My first job ever was working as a Russian language broadcaster for the Voice of America. And that was in the early 1970s. So I was very familiar with, media, propaganda, et cetera. So I would say that the Soviet period did have, no question, for ideological and technical reasons, more of a linear quality to it. We had, message over here, communism is good, message and capitalism is bad. And then over here we had communism bad, capitalism good, and it was kind of a battle. I would think of it kind of that type of battle. And there was an ideology, Marxism, Leninism, an ideology that you could look up in a textbook. So it was more rational. Now, today, I would say that it's much more diffused. We could get into 5 hours of discussion, I think, on whether there is such a thing as Putinism, but there is a kind of a nascent ideology, whatever you want to call it, that Putin has. I think it's very flexible, not so sure it's very defined, and it's useful. It can be changed. It can contradict itself. But in any case, there is a message, but the message is very convoluted and not linear at all. And some of it is contradictory in itself. There are messages that Putin's people, the propaganda people, send out that contradict the same thing they said 2 minutes ago. And there's a purpose to that, too, which we can talk about. I know Peter has really opened my eyes to a lot of that. So I'd say it is a more confusing situation ideologically and with the, conceptually. And then I would say technically, because of the internet, it is far more confusing and very, very difficult to even grasp what Russian propaganda is today.
Okay. Yes, well, any brief, quick comment from you, Peter, there on that?
Well, thank you for the compliment. But I wonder, do we want to go down the rabbit hole, but it's quite an important rabbit hole, of how we're defining disinformation? Because from what I understand, and there could be people in the room who understand far more than me, if we're talking about the Soviet term, in a sense, Disinformation, we're talking about quite a specific activity within active measures. So quite specific psyopsy type things. So, for example, I don't know, famously the story that the US created AIDS as a weapon against the African subcontinent. So, and from what I understand, again, there might be people in the room who know more than me, but from what I've understood, that's really quite different to propaganda. So this is something that is created within the security services, within the secret services, within a specific department of the secret services during the Cold War. And then there's propaganda, which might be stuffed full of spies, but at the end of the day was its own system. So I wonder and then we have this term disinformation, which is, what do we mean by that? Do we mean false content? Do we mean lack of attribution? So the content might be true, but the person is disinforming you, the actor is disinforming you about its provenance. So I do wonder what specifically are we talking about?
That's a very good point.
And I don't mean that academically, by the way. I mean that as in, like, what is it that we're trying to stop? That's kind of the question.
A question of definition is very important, and hopefully that will be illustrated by the discussion we're now about to have in responding to the question. But I remember feeling in the post-Soviet times, immediately post-Soviet times, pretty dismissive of Soviet whatever disinformation propaganda, because it had been so manifestly unsuccessful. But if we move on now to let's say the last 10 years in recent times, can we maybe Sarah may start with some comments on what she sees as the more successful or the less successful example of Russian disinformation, or whatever we call it, campaigns in the US and elsewhere in the world, more or less 10 years.
Yeah, I would say the most successful Russian campaigns are ones that resonate with what's going on in the particular targeted country. And so the Russians are pretty good at tailoring their messages to specific countries, whether that's Poland or France or the United States. And the United States is just a particularly fertile ground for Russian messaging right now, because we have a lot of divisions within our societies, a lot of arguments. And so that makes for some great opportunities to come in and talk about, well, look, democracy doesn't work. And that's one of the key messages that Russia wants to get across. So I think this conversation is really interesting about, what is propaganda, what is disinformation. I like to think of things as narratives or strategic narratives. Like, what is Russia trying to talk us into? Democracy is flawed and failing. Russia is a resurgent great nation. Those are two of the biggies that you can trace right back to Putin. And I'd like to say briefly that in terms of thinking about what Russia is trying to do, you also have to think about media models in general. And the Soviet media model was not to inform the public. It was to tell people how great communism was and get them on board with it. And it's interesting to know that I do think that the Russian media are neo-Soviet in the sense that they don't think about serving and informing the public, but they think about getting a message out and convincing people of that message. And a final, and this will be the last compliment to Peter during the panel, we promise. But his book, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, it's also really important to think about, because they're not trying to convince you of things based on fact. They're working much more on tearing down the notion that there can be an informed public and creating a fantasy world that they can manipulate.
Right. Well, thank you. And we all understand that we must not continually compliment Peter. That seems to be a clear rule here.
Okay.
No, but we're reminded of the complexity, all the same, of the situation that we're confronting, and I welcome comments maybe from whoever here on the relationship between what we're seeing and hearing in the sort of media and disinformation, however we define it, and then the state, if you like. I mean, that was very clear in Soviet times, but the state now and the sort of the structure and the management and organization of this, what the military might call C2, the command and control of the disinformation campaigns, and how that is managed and led and directed eventually from the Kremlin. Who would like to come forward and try to illustrate that?
Right. I mean, look, I mean, one researches this field, one gets many kind of flowcharts thrown at one by researchers who spend a lot more time nerding out on this than me. And really, we're talking about in a sense, quite an interesting model. If I'm trying to sort of summarize all these different flowcharts that I've seen since the full-scale invasion started. On the one hand, there's a top-down element. Everything comes back to the presidential administration, and specifically Gromov and Kirienko, and kind of many roads lead to them. So you have this top-down model, and as I documented from my time in Russia, 2001, 2010, the main TV channels come for their sort of like weekly briefing in the presidential administration, and they're given the instructions, which are then fleshed out through temniki, which are documents, and we have the documents which show like what are the general lines, like we love China, we hate America, whatever. That's the simple bit, and that's in a sense, though much more fluid, but still quite, as we imagine Soviet propaganda, quite top down. But what's interesting is that you then have this huge scope of improvisation, where almost every security department has its own legacy, but more online media ecosystem. So, the army will have one. The mercenaries had their own one, during the Prigozhin period. The GRU will have their own one, the SVR their own one. They're often competing, they're often undermining each other. They're involved with security operations. I think the most important thing we have to underline over and over and over again is that these are information operations completely integrated into security operations and into the commissioning of crimes. This is not just propaganda and messaging. These are full spectrum operations which, make it possible to attempt to excuse the bombing of hospitals. These are targeted operation with a kinetic effect, especially in the time of war. But what's interesting is that they're allowed to fight amongst each other, and there's a sort of, Putinist interior checks and balances which are meant to happen. And it's very amusing watching them squabble. So I think that's what we're really looking at. We're looking at a combination, and then the various oligarchs like Malafeyev will have their own operations, and then there are various proxies like various pro-Russian businessmen throughout Central Europe. So what they're trying to do is combine the discipline of the top-down centralized approach with something which is much more suited to the modern networked world. So I think that's the model, and it's constantly evolving. It has Achilles' heels. At the end of the day, when we see a sudden exogenous shock, like Prigozhin's mutiny, like the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk, the system freezes. Nobody knows what to say. Everybody often starts blaming number one, maybe directly, but indirectly. So even though it's a system that is supple, there are moments when it freezes over, it stalls, and yet we never take advantage of that, which is hugely frustrating.
Yeah, good. That's very clear. And I'm also wondering about the terrorist attack in March this
Which
year.
Terrorist attack? It's been wiped from the consciousness.
Yeah, and I'd like to follow on that in that it's both incredibly intricate and it shows some signs of fragility, which I find, like I thought it fascinating that at one point I think the Kremlin was frustrated because there were groups on Telegram that wanted more attacks on Ukraine. So it becomes, you can see moments where they're losing control of this. And if you lose control of the media narrative, and we saw this when the Soviet Union broke down, it can happen really, really fast, and it can have devastating consequences.
So, John,
Yes.
could I jump in for 2 seconds?
Please.
I'd like to second that motion. I was in Moscow for the full-scale invasion in 2022, and it was fascinating to watch because, of course, the United States government was saying, with a very interesting technique of prebuttal as opposed to rebuttal, the U.S. government was saying, we have intel that shows Russia is going to invade Ukraine. And I was watching constant Russian TV, and every single spokesperson, every show said, no way, we are not going to invade. That is a big lie. In fact, there was one, I think it was a comedian, who said, it's 10:23, we haven't invaded yet, what's going on? They were actually mocking it. And then all of a sudden they invaded. And it was a really fascinating moment because state TV had no idea what to say, and they just stopped. They didn't explain anything. But there was one thing that I just wanted to very quickly pick up on. Peter mentioned the AIDS and HIV propaganda that came from Disinformation, which came from the Soviet government in the mid-'80s. And you could see it, almost the same thing, in Ukraine around that same time, biolabs. And this is a great example of an idea, a formal presentation of disinformation that is spread with a deliberate, organized approach. And that was, at the beginning, it actually goes back to probably Crimea 2014, maybe even earlier, but the Russian government, actually through its propaganda, was saying that the United States had biolabs that are in Ukraine, and it had created a lot of different problems in the world, including, I think, COVID. They worked that in. But this continues to this day. There are a lot of people who believe that the United States does have biolabs in Ukraine, which is not true. But I think that because health is, as Sarah was pointing out, if you maximize or you glom onto something that people genuinely are worried about in that country and maybe know something but not enough about it, that's fertile ground. AIDS was scary, COVID-19 was scary, biolabs are scary, and then you can maximize the scare factor.
Perhaps I'd just pick that up quickly, and then we can move on also to help move on to the next question, which is the link between Russian disinformation campaigns, if we can define them, and the way they're aligned with certain policy objectives, for example, in Ukraine, or the wider international campaign relating to the global south. But the biolabs example, for example, you could argue that is all, in spite of what Jill is just saying, has had a relatively limited effect. I mean, remember, in terms of being believed very widely. I mean, it goes back to the point in 2022, and actually I was in Moscow, I should say, the week before the invasion. I got out just in time, unlike obviously Jill there, and being told that there wouldn't be an invasion at all. And when I look back on it, I'm inclined to think that even the senior people who were telling me that actually didn't think there would be an invasion. We have to remember that too. The disinformation and so on can spread within the system itself, even to quite a high level. But the way they talked all the time about neo-Nazi government, for example, you don't hear that nearly so much now, because that really hasn't gained credibility, understandably. So the way things have moved on. But moving on to how things are now and the messages that they're putting out now, for example, relating to Ukraine, you may wish to comment on that. And I don't know, Sarah or Peter might wish to comment, or any of you might wish to comment on the emphasis on NATO aggression, or NATO as an aggressive force, the war with the West, which is there. The issue of NATO expansion, for example, back from the post-Cold War period, and the promise not to expand, which I was certainly told about endlessly in 3 years ago when I was there. Yeah. And then, of course, the messages which come out to the global south about the decline of the West and so on. Is it more effective now, the messages they're putting out, than, let's say, it was immediately after the invasion?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and I actually wrote a chapter about this in my book, and it was inspired by meeting someone in an elevator in a parking garage in Silver Spring, who was carrying a Peace Now sign and informed me that NATO was the aggressor in the war in Ukraine. He picked the wrong person to say this to. In the end, he literally fled from me, running away, as I made all the points about, no, there was never any, not one step eastward, no, the Russians are lying, this, that, and the other thing. So I think the reason why the NATO narrative, like that NATO is an aggressive bully that, you know, is an existential threat to Russia and hence forced Russia to defend itself by invading Ukraine, much like the Biolabs, this is not true. And I think when I looked at the elite newspapers in the United States, Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, I found they did not push back against this claim when Putin made it. They often allowed the Russians to make this assertion about NATO without telling the reader the background and the reasons why this is a spurious argument. They also let the lie about NATO was never supposed to expand. You can read the chapter to see all the fascinating history about why that's not true. But that one has found a lot of echoes and narratives in the United States. You can see it. You can see this argument being made and not being pushed back against. It's also interesting that these elite newspapers most commonly quote John Mersheimer, and Professor Mersheimer pushes this argument that NATO is to blame for the invasion of Ukraine. Why would you quote that person more frequently than someone like Jill Dougherty or Peter Pomerantsev or Fiona Hill or Mike McFaul or a lot of other people who know much better? So there's this willful, almost ignorance of Russian and Soviet history that is very frustrating, because my generation certainly knows, you know, why NATO was important, what NATO does, what the Warsaw Pact was, why the Cold War happened, but younger people, including that poor guy holding the sign that I actually feel kind of bad about now, you know, he didn't know about Soviet aggression. So I think Jill's point about know your history, right? Know what the Soviets were doing. The neo-Nazi argument that neo-Nazis are rife in Ukraine never found resonance. And that's really interesting, because either it was not reported because people found it ludicrous, or when it was reported, it was ridiculed in a way the NATO claim is not. So that's a little bit on, as much as I hate to say this, it's a little bit on American journalists allowing that to happen.
Yeah. Okay. And a particular point about, you know, in what is the most effective, maybe a disinformation point or maybe Russian information point relating to Ukraine. May I suggest the basic idea that it's a waste of money, the campaign, you know, pushing that theme and the resonance that gains. Is that a fair point or not a fair point?
Yeah, I'm going to leap in, then I'll be quiet. Then I'll put it over to you. The reason why that claim works is because Trump says the same thing. And I'm not, making any claims about Trump being, pro-Russia or whatever. But Trump has consistently said, and certainly Vance, the vice president-elect, has said, we shouldn't be spending American dollars in Ukraine. Now, most of that money actually is spent in the United States, actually, on weapons manufacture and other things. So that's a point that doesn't get brought up, and also journalists don't really challenge that, perhaps as they should. But that's why it works. If you're saying the same thing that a very, an incoming president's saying, well, that's going to have a lot more power. And now I'll turn it over.
I was just, sorry, any quick comment on that? I was just saying that it's quite effective in Europe too.
Yeah. Sir John, I think that's a factor, but I do think a bigger factor really is this idea that the United States and NATO are, as they say in the Republic of Georgia right now, the party of war. That the United States starts wars all over the world. It always has, even since Vietnam. We create problems, and we are, this is all in quotes, of course, and we are using Ukraine in order to attack Russia, take over Russia, and win a war against Russia. And I find that in so many places, it's really effective. I think it leverages some of the old Soviet stuff, but it's also effective even in the developing world or the global south or whatever you want to call it. It's very effective. And I don't think we should forget that one of the main audiences right now for Russian propaganda is the developing world. It's Latin America and especially Africa. It's hugely important, and it's not talked about quite as much as I think it should be. But we should be aware that the messages are quite effective in those parts of the world.
Well, and picking that point up and extending it, the projection of Russian values, if you like, which of course is coming across powerfully, this message, and what we might call conservative values, which then plays into the theme of the decline of the West and the decline of liberalism and the wokeism and so on. And that, of course, has potential resonance in the global South too. Peter, any comments on that?
I mean, I just got back from South Africa, and I heard over and over the line that this is NATO's war, and you know, Ukraine's agency is completely absent from the discussions that I was involved in there. That wasn't a statistical analysis, but to what Jill was saying, that idea was hegemonic. Look, I think if we're talking about these sort of information operations, they work when they play into the information logic of a country. And Sarah already mentioned when it goes along with the grain of what is being said. That's, you know, one of the, I often hear people saying, well, look, Russian propaganda doesn't do anything. It's all here anyway. I'm like, no. A successful information operation will understand the narrative trends and latch onto them. Yeah, that is like the definition of what it does. So when you so they're very good at that. But it's not just about ideas like, you know, the lure of a certain type of conservatism or defeatism about democracy. It's also understanding the way information is processed in our system. I mean, what military people call an OODA loop. That's when it's most effective. So you could talk about, I mean, the really over-discussed issues of 2016, but the effective operation the Russians did wasn't the kind of the wave of content that they put onto Facebook, which is impossible to measure in its effectiveness, vis-a-vis America, I mean. But when they sort of hacked the DNC, leaked the information to Julian Assange, he then spread it. It then spread in mainstream media and was then used in the presidential debates. That came from an understanding of how we process information and inserting their necessary narratives into there so we do the work. Now, the way that has been most prevalent since the full-scale invasion has been their understanding of our theories of escalation and what I suspect that only historians will be able to tell us, a very clear understanding of the US president's personal fears around nuclear confrontation. No, those are serious fears. But understanding that and understanding precisely how that any kind of nuclear threats would be processed by the system and how that would essentially put it into a bind would have been analyzed in Moscow. Yeah, they're not just throwing it out there. They understand this has to if we say this, it'll go through this process and this will delay Western responses. The same thing with the takeover of Crimea when there were Russian soldiers with no Russian chevrons. Everyone knew they were Russian soldiers. So as a piece of disinformation, it wasn't very effective. But they knew that the fact there were no chevrons would mean that NATO would have to sit, discuss this, that Russia's friends in NATO would go, well, we just don't know if they're Russian soldiers, do we? That would delay the process, that would delay the response, and it took a huge amount of effort inside of NATO to overcome that. So I think that's very important, understanding the trends, but also understanding how information is processed by our media ecology and by our security decision-making. That's what makes an operation effective.
Okay, no, I get that. Well, we've got to finish off this part of the discussion now, just very quickly. If I can just say one final point, how best, in simple terms, to counter this? What should we be doing effectively to counter this, what we have been talking about? Sarah or Jill, would you like to come in on that?
I'll go briefly. It's funny because Jill and I were talking about this before we started. Know your Russian narrative. That's what I would say. Know what's being pushed at you, because at this point, it's just going to come at you. It might come at you from the influencer that you follow. It might come at you from a journalist sort of quoting Russian propaganda unknowingly. It might come at you from that website you thought was a news website, but really is a front. So know your Russian narrative. Know your history. And I think I could go on and on, but I won't. So I'll throw it
Thank you. I know,
over
Jill.
to Jill.
Well, I want to get to questions. Obviously, we all want to hear what the audience wants to hear. But I would say, there are two levels to that question, Sir John. One would be, what does a government do? How do you respond? Because, you do have our intelligence people and then our understanding of how we answer those let's say, answer that disinformation. That's one question. And then what Sarah's talking about is the individual person. I would say for individual people, which is almost easier to talk about, I would say you sit there and say, okay, I just got a bit of information. Why am I getting this information now? Where do I think it's coming from, which is very hard to answer, usually. But what does this information appear to want to make me do? Because remember, the Russians were pulling, back in Black Lives Matter movement, they were pulling people out onto the streets who were pro-Black Lives Matter and anti, extreme white nationalists. They wanted them to literally fight in the streets. So I would say, slow down, analyze, where's this coming from? Why am I getting it right now? Why not a week ago? Why not a week from now? And then what does it want? What's it trying to do to me? And then it helps me to understand, oh, I get it. They want me to give up and not vote or whatever.
Yeah,
Peter?
right. Okay. Well, and give up supporting Ukraine. Right. Well, there we are. I think we need to move on to the questions and answers from our audience now. Jennifer.
No, thank you. As you said at the beginning, it would be very difficult to cut this conversation off because you guys have such
I know, yeah.
wonderful comments to make. We're going to open up. We've got about 25 minutes. We can do questions. Just a reminder for our online audience. I know I already see the questions coming in, but for those of you online, you can submit your questions by email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, by X to @KennanInstitute, or by Facebook. You can just post a message on our page. And again, questions are coming in. Please keep sending them. I'll try to alternate between in-person and online. So we'll start with one question first back there.
Good morning. My name is Katerina Odarchenko, Institute for Democracy and Development, and I have background in election organizing in Eastern Europe. So I have a question about money, because generally if we talk about this method of which Disinformation Forensic Lab in Atlantic Council do, which you doing, and thank you for that, it's more like working with opinion leaders, journalists, think tankers, like more educated people. But generally, disinformation which put by Russians in Eastern Europe, like Slovakia, Czech Republic, not so successful, but still, and even in Germany, it's generally disinformation which put to people who not so prepared and generally sometimes without degree. And people who do this disinformation, so bot firmy like Trolls Labs and who do fake websites, they generally also live in Russia or in Slovakia or in Hungary. So how you see stopping of financing of this disinformation activity? Because as I see from Ukrainian perspective, before war, they put more than $100 million to their network of disinformation, from TV channels till internet work and so on and so forth, and newspapers in villages. So what about money? Thank you.
I'm going to pass on money.
Yeah, look, I think the question isn't just about money. The question is disruption. Yeah, how do you disrupt the system? Because we've been focusing very much on the content, but you're quite right. If you're really serious about tackling this, you think about how do you break down the model. The money bit, that's what the DOJ focused on in its indictments around the funding of YouTubers here. So you catch them out legally on something. It was essentially a money laundering or a fake money moving charge. The problem with money is that it's quite easy then to find new paths. Yeah, crypto plays a very big role in this sphere now as well. So money is one place you can disrupt. The other place you can disrupt is pressure on platforms. Yeah, so the people, not just social media platforms, but whoever's hosting this, where are they based? The other thing you can disrupt are people. A lot of the time, the networks organizing this are actually aligned with, directly or indirectly, with Russian security services. You can go after those people. and so on and so forth. So you would, just as with military supply chains, you create a disruption map, and you think what are its vulnerabilities, and you go for them. I'm not sure money is the biggest vulnerability, by the way. I think there are so many ways of funding these days. I'm not entirely sure that's the problem. It's a bit like microchips, in military supply chains. Everyone focused on microchips, which are the worst thing to focus on because they're everywhere. And it's been a bit of a task to get people to know, think about the CNC machines. That's the vulnerability. Same with the information ecosystem. Find the bit that's actually at the top of the chain that you can target. But no one's really doing that, to be honest. I mean, the DOJ thing was the first time I saw someone thinking about it structurally.
No, I think that's, yeah.
I'll take a question from our online audience. Glenn Wright asks from Kiev, Ukraine, do you see any differences between the way that Russia and China use disinformation methods and techniques?
Really question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think comparing the different ways that countries attempt to carry out hybrid warfare, information warfare, is really valuable. I'm going to cheat here. I have a student, a PhD student who's now a doctor, Dr. Wei-Ping Li, and she studies Chinese propaganda. Chinese propaganda, I would argue, is not as good at echoing sort of the things that Americans want, because I think that's where Russian propaganda is really quite good at echoing and supporting and finding people who chime with particular narratives and values, like conservative values, or we're spending too much money on the war. I would argue that studies of Chinese propaganda has not really found that access to the far right the way that the Russians have, and the far right is a very powerful voice. So I turn it over to you.
I would just jump in very quickly. I think Chinese propaganda still, although it's changing, comes from a position that they believe that the Chinese approach, the rise of China and Chinese way of doing things is actually something that the world would want and that they should propagate. So in a sense, it's more positive. It's more, we've got a message, China has a way of doing things. People around the world can benefit. We can all rise together. Now, there's another side to that, of course, but the Russians don't do that. I mean, the Russians are basically about undermining the West and any approach to the way we do democracy. So I think at this point, they're kind of different, but I do think the Chinese are moving in the Russian direction, unfortunately, more and more.
Great. Take a question in the back.
Greetings, I'm Carl Heike Yorkson from the Joint Baltic American National Committee, J-Bank. I'm curious, how could we take back the independent space from Russian influences such as Tenet, because there are many youth and dissatisfied people that will focus on just independent media and other sources, and this is how they fall in the Russian rabbit hole.
So studies of the media suggest, of course, the younger you are, the less likely you are to engage with traditional media outlets, right? New York Times, CNN. However, those outlets still hold the information heights and still have immense power over how Americans think and what they engage with. So I do think there are people in rabbit holes. I think this has a lot to do with social media companies and algorithms, which are not helpful. But I'm not as much in despair as perhaps I should be, because I still think that there is a central way of thinking about being American and American news that does hold the country together. And maybe that's a Weasley answer, right? Because these people definitely exist, and you can definitely, particularly when you look at some of the YouTube influencers, you're like, wow, that's where you get your news. That and Epic Times, that's a little concerning. But is that too optimistic, guys?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Right.
Please, if you guys, if you want to share some pessimism.
No, on the optimism. Sorry, Jill.
No, You go, Peter, and then I'll.
No, I mean, I think the pessimism is so widely analysed. I mean, like, I've only been in America a few years, and I have been doing a bunch of sociology about what Americans think, not just about Ukraine and Russia, but about the world in general. And Americans across the political spectrum and across the social spectrum are in a bit of an identity crisis. And they can understand, this comes through in both in polling, but even more in sort of in-depth interviews and focus groups. They understand that there are threats out there. Yeah, they understand that China and Russia and Iran don't wish them ill. And they understand that it's about control. Yeah, they understand that one phrase that we heard, we can't set the clock anymore. We're going to be like the kids, and the Russians and the Chinese are going to send us up to bed. They kind of understand it's connected to supply chains and sea lanes and energy and who controls titanium. They have a sense of a world in flux and that America is out of control. Yeah, and that we're not in charge of our own freedom anymore. But because no one's really explained to them how, they end up kind of going, okay, let's just retreat from it. You know, it's all too crazy. Then you ask, like, but can you really retreat from a complex world? And say, no, we know we can't. But it's so confusing, we want to. And until somebody starts explaining how the modern world works, what are the real threats, how Russia and China want to, I don't know, control sea lanes in the Middle East or control grain shipments from Ukraine in order to have control over the American economy and send America up to sleep, which is exactly what they want to do. Until someone starts explaining that, and until somebody explains how we start using America's economic and political power to counter that, we're going to be in this place where people want to do everything to run away from the world. And that's a very dangerous place. So there is this gap between what people feel. People get it. You know, they understand on a gut level something is wrong and there are bad actors, but nobody has explained to them how this world works and what to do about it. The person who can will reap huge dividends.
If I can just pick that up for a minute. I mean, it's underlining the point that, like everything else, really, one has to know what one is talking about if you're trying to explain and persuade people to think in a open-minded and sensible way. So that means that we have to. I'm sorry, there's a dog barking in the background. My apologies. It's not a Russian dog. It's a British dog. Yeah. That means that first we've got to understand. We've really got to work to understand what we're discussing now, and then we've got to have the ability to put that across, and explain that, to society more widely. And there is, because this is very fast moving, there is a lot of confusion there, and you can see that everybody, the colleagues here are worried about that and are thinking about it. So, that's a question of making sure the public are aware. Certainly, reference has been made to accountability. The channels and and so on, and the media bases and sites need to be accountable for what they are putting across. And then, of course, it also means, and others may have a point on this, it's international cooperation between liberal democracies, to define it well. Because here I'm thinking, you're all understandably talking about the United States, but what about Europe? And in particular, the far right in Europe, which is noticeably become really influential and has a clear history in some, but not all cases, of being open to Russian thinking. Are those fair comments?
Very quickly, Sir John, I think you're absolutely right. And I would say a big problem right now is that this lack of faith in the media or any really reliable source of information affects the right and the left. You hear almost the same thing from ultra-rightists and people on the far left, which is they don't believe the media, everybody lies, and then everybody's kind of left to his own devices in this space, which is very, very dangerous, actually.
Yeah, and just to add, I don't think there's any one, just as there's no one type of Russian, I don't think there's any one type of American. I think Americans, and there was a fascinating survey done by NORC, N-O-R-C, that came out a week ago or so that talked about the different sort of 5 different types of Americans. And some are these well-informed people who believe in America, but there's definitely a segment of Americans who are, as you described, they've given up, they're overwhelmed, they're just not going to engage. And then there are those who engage, as the gentleman pointed out, who engage in alternative facts. They do their own research. Someone once told me that in line waiting for a vaccine, and I'm like, what does that? She was anti-vax and waiting in line for a vaccine. To me, that explains America of today.
I'm going to take another question from our online audience, and I'll go back to in person. I'm Senior Program Manager. This week has seen massive protests against Georgian Dream after their comments about pausing European integration efforts. Can you speak to the Russian disinformation efforts driving Georgia away from the West? What does Bidzina Ivanishvili see appealing in Russia today?
Well, Jill just got back.
Yeah, that's what I've been focusing on a lot. I've been there twice in the past year. I would say, shorthand, there are probably about 3 different things. I mentioned the party of war. Russia, claims that Georgia is next after Ukraine, that the West is going to try to push Georgia into a conflict like Ukraine or to join Ukraine. Second would be traditional values, very big. Georgia passed a law just a few months ago, a very Russian-style anti-LGBT law. And then I think let's call it sovereignty nationalism, which is also a big trend. And the way I would describe it is, Georgians actually are very proud of their country and their culture, et cetera. And so what the government, actually the Georgian Dream ruling party, which is influenced by Russia, and friendly to Russia is probably the better way to put it, they make the case that, yes, we would like to be part of the West. We would definitely like to be part of Europe, which, of course, is why people are on the streets right now. Nobody believes it. But what they would say is, we want to join the EU, but on our terms. We are a sovereign country. We have our own way of doing things, and we'll join, but we want it our way. And I think those 3 are coming together very effectively in Georgia. However, the demonstrations now are showing that quite a lot of Georgians don't agree with that.
Hello, my name is Bronson Shepard. I am an economics student and soccer player. I've enjoyed very much learning from y'all's perspective today. And with everything that Russia is doing to spread disinformation and division in the United States, is it possible for the U.S. and our allies to return the favor, as it were, and use social media to turn the Russian people against Putin, but of course with truth?
I have a long essay in Foreign Affairs from a couple of weeks ago that is about this. So without getting into the details, I think 2 main points. One, we've spent the last 10 years analyzing Russian, Chinese, Iranian, hybrid warfare, whatever you want to call it, information psychological warfare. Back in the day, it used to be called political warfare. And this is something we used to be very good at ourselves. So in the Second World War, I just finished the book about the British political warfare executive that was used against the Nazis in occupied Europe. In the Cold War, there was the interesting role of the US Information Agency. We used to take the space seriously, yeah? And you're quite right, you don't have to use the same tactics as the other side, the same methods, but you have to invest in it. In terms of within Russia specifically, it probably isn't the obvious place to start because it's the hardest one. There's so much more to do in the countries around Russia, in Moldova, in Georgia, in Armenia, in Kyrgyzstan, in the global south. There are much easier markets to work in than a dictatorship because they're more contested spaces. But within Russia, so I think one has to start from an analysis of what does information mean in Russia. It's not a democracy. Yeah, it doesn't matter if you turn. So what, you'll turn people against Putin? There's no election. Yeah, he doesn't care. So that kind of logic of a public sphere and influencing the public sphere doesn't exist in a country where there is no idea of a public in the democratic sense. Yeah, a public that influences politics. That's what a public is. However, the regime in Russia is obsessed with social control. They're constantly using propaganda domestically for a reason. They're constantly doing social research, huge amounts of actually very, very clever sociology to work out what people are thinking and feeling all the time. They're constantly monitoring what people say and what people do and try to control it. They have their own idea of control. Yeah, they're very, to sort of memify it, they're very traumatized by 1991, the way that the Soviet regime suddenly lost total control. They're very paranoid about the same thing happening again, that they are, never more than a moment away from the whole thing crumbling. And you see that paranoia in so much of Russian online discourse, yeah? Everything's about to burst. Everything is about to be destroyed. So therefore, your aim isn't so much to turn people against Putin in the hope of a democratic movement. That there's nothing like that on the horizon. But if you can start to get the regime to question the extent to which they can control society, yeah, then that might change their calculations around waging a belligerent war. Yeah, then the costs go up. So it's a bit like with the economic stuff as well, We're putting pressure on them, theoretically, so they start recalculating. So it's not so much about turning Russians against Putin. That's might well be a pointless exercise, yeah? But it's working out what they're worried about, yeah? What are the sectors of society and the economy that they hold dearly, and getting them to question their sense of control. So that's how you would build it. That's what you would have to have your theory of change around. And that's perfectly possible. They do not control what people say and do around inflation, around household savings. I'm not even going to get into the ethnic tensions within the country. I'll give you one little anecdote, though. Tensions are so bad within the Russian army that when the Ukrainians moved into Kursk, ethnic Russians were giving up the Chechen units. That's how bad relationships are. Yeah? So it is a country seething with tensions, seething with contradictions, with a huge amount of economic resentment that's building in the context of inflation that makes Joe Biden's look quite small. Mm-hmm. We are not doing anything to lay a hand on that, and I think that's as long as we don't, the war will get worse and worse and worse.
And it's
I think.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Sorry. If I could just say that's extremely interesting comment and convincing comment, and very well expressed. Is understanding, the particular situation in the particular country that you're talking about, and the reference to 1991. And I was there at the time and saw it. I mean, it is just not forgotten, and creates that atmosphere of brittle sort of, vulnerability. And in spite of everything about it not being a democracy and all the rest of it, the fact is people know that what they're hearing, they believe I find anyway, the propaganda which comes out, but they know it's propaganda from state media and so on. It's a complicated situation, very different really from the one that we have reflecting the history. And so understanding that, you have to understand it before you then make your points effectively. And then my final point there is that's a question for our political leaders, for our leaders, and for the ones with voices, ones with audiences. Do our political leaders even begin to understand that? And therefore, are they really able to react to it in our own self-defense?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head. I don't think our leaders understand it. And I don't think we really, that's the problem with being a democracy, right? Aside from all the mess and violence, that democracy has just inherently. We are not, as an American government, supposed to force propaganda onto overseas, into other countries. I've always been very tempted to highlight lifestyle bloggers into the Russian sort of sphere and say, look at these fantastic, lovely lifestyles we have as ordinary people. And that's just a guess. in terms of that. I also think inflation is rising. The ruble is falling against the dollar very precipitously this week. To me, I think that is going to create a lot of
Yes.
deep discomfort in a country in which a generation ago people's savings and lives were wiped out by hyperinflation. So I watched that like a hawk. Every day I check the ruble against the dollar to think, okay, could this be it? Could this be it?
Very, very good point.
We're getting close on time. I'll take one more question from the audience and one online question.
Mitchell Pullman. I've been involved in disinformation projects, and I've often done quite a bit of work observing elections, including in Russia. And I've also been involved in domestic politics. My question is, I wonder to what extent, about a decade ago when we actually had Russians coming to Washington, one of the things I'd often hear is, nobody here talks about Russia. Nobody pays any attention to Russia. And now, of course, we're all paying attention to Russia. That's why we're here. But I also noticed this year, in our election year, domestic political groups, I kept meeting people who were working on Russian disinformation, who had backgrounds in Russian relations and spoke Russian, and they were working for domestic political groups, including, I might add, African-American organizations. I hear on African-American progressive radio, I hear discussions of Russia. So I'm wondering to what extent is this really about getting our attention, as well as I don't dispute that it's also about undermining our democracy, but to what extent is this just to kind of put out there that we're Russia, we matter, we're important in this world, and we want you to pay attention to us?
Well, I'll jump in. It's a complex question, I think, but the one thing that drives Russians crazy is that we don't pay attention to them. Many Russians still think of themselves as the superpower, the other superpower, and for years, they've been focused on on the United States as the other superpower, and why don't they pay attention to us? And Putin has said this in pathetic statements, well, they'll pay attention to us, that type of thing. So I think that actually is a point of weakness. I believe in mockery. I think mockery and trolling is just wonderful, and we could occasionally make fun of the fact that they feel abandoned by, nobody cares about them. But it is a serious issue too. I think that we cannot overinterpret what they can do to us. They can do to us a lot of bad things because we are doing a lot of bad things to ourselves. And if we continue to be divided, they can take advantage of that because, as everybody on the panel here has said, the Russians like to exploit the weaknesses and the divisions in the country that they have targeted. And we have a lot of that right now. So, they're good at their game, but they're not infallible. And so I think, remember, if in kind of, crass terms, like if we say, oh my goodness, RT has just suddenly, changed the American election, Russia Today has changed the American election, and oh my goodness, all their propaganda is working. RT is going to go to the Kremlin and say, hey, it's working, give us more money, we really deserve, it's kind of like an ad for them. So we can say, yes, they're effective, but we also have to realize there are other players, China, Iran, others, and that the United States, to me, is the big problem right now. The internal divisions in our country are just massive, and we will continue to be taken advantage of because of that.
We are getting very close. As opposed to taking another question, maybe I'll actually give each of the panelists just 60 seconds, 90 seconds, something you want to wrap up with that you think is a good takeaway for people. Sarah?
Okay. I think the questions have been great. I think that the takeaway is we're going into the unknown. So we have a new president coming in. We we don't really know what his relationship with Russia and Ukraine will be. I think this is a very important time to watch and be wary of, Russian propaganda. I'll just end with that.
I think we're just entering a 21st century. We're well into a 21st century, but where because countries became so interconnected through globalization 1.0, it actually means the kind of risks of direct wars between the big powers quite unlikely because they are interdependent. So there'll be more Ukraines. Taiwan is something people are obsessing about, but many other sort of like horrible wars. But maybe the large powers won't get completely at war with one another. But they are going to be in a confrontation, and that'll be fought through political and economic warfare. And we just have to sort of realize that this is the new game, and we're going to have to get good at it. We have to win. I mean, apart from right and wrong and disinformation, information, and media ecosystems, we also have to win. And at the moment, the other side takes this space very, very seriously. Some of it's effective, some of it's ineffective, some of it's self-serving and a business, but they take it very seriously. And we just haven't. Well, we've woken up, but we haven't taken the next step of creating the institutions that are going to compete in call it hybrid, in the hybrid wars of the 21st century. That term never really caught on. I quite like it, actually.
Well, I guess I'm worried. I'm worried on an existential basis. I'm worried that because the world is very confusing, that the question that people ask themselves, is there truth? Is there any truth out there? Can we believe anything that we see or read or take in? That question is very, I understand it, and sometimes I ask myself that question, but I think if you don't believe that ultimately there is something true out there, there's some reality out there, then your entire, worldview just gives up. And I think that, if I look at what the purpose, not only of Russia, but I think some other bad actors out there, is to tell people, just give up, don't try to get involved, be depoliticized, be infantilized, just sit there in your closet and don't do anything because it's all too confusing and terrible and horrible and I don't understand it. And maybe he's right and maybe she's right. That's exactly where they want us. So I think it's really important for us to take it seriously, as everyone's been saying. Well, obviously you're here, you take it seriously, but to really understand that it's a psychological war to make you just sit home and not do anything. And that's scary to me. It's philosophical, and it's important. So anyway, on that note, that happy note.
Sir John, any parting comments?
Well, my final comment for a very good discussion is that, of course, we've been talking almost entirely about Russia. And we must not talk ourselves into any kind of sort of big over-worry or panic about this. We mustn't become too defensive. And we certainly must make sure, and the discussion helped here, I think, to understand, as much as we can, about the realism of what is and is not happening in Russian society, Russian politics, Russian government, and so on. And the point has come out that there is an underlying sense of vulnerability, deep vulnerability for, very obvious historical reasons there. And it's also, quite quickly it becomes emotional. And we see that, all over the place around the Ukraine campaign, justification for it, and the propaganda, the disinformation relating to it, and so on. And therefore, that's another thing we have to think about and worry about, because that kind of emotion and that kind of existential worry, to use that word again, existential, can lead to big mistakes and very dangerous decisions. So it's just a reminder, this is part of a wider debate, which is really very, very important. And it's certainly my top preoccupation in present times.
Please join me in thanking our excellent panel guests, Sir John Scarlett, Dr. Sarah Oates, Peter Pomerantsev, and Jill Dougherty. And thank you again very much, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you.
All right. That was a